This was maybe 8 or 9 years back. I was an office worker at the time. It was not uncommon that we would have to stay back to work late at times to catch up on paperwork, especially as the financial year came to an end. It was one of such nights. It wasn't quite the deadline, but I was going on vacation soon and had to get all my work in order. I won't go into details as that is not what this story is about, and the boredom would stop you from listening. As fate would have it, I was the last one left, hunched over my desk in my cubicle, trying to get all my work done. As a rule, to save money, if there was only 1 or 2 people in the office, then only their personal desk lights and the bare minimum of lighting would be used. So my desk was an island in a sea of blackness. I wasn't quite the only one in the building though. There was a security guard at his desk on level 1, who would do rounds from time to time, and also a small cleaning crew, who would be through around 2 to 3 a.m. I was hoping to be out by then, but maybe I wouldn't. So I was at my desk, hating my life, dreaming of the vacation I was going on, and really seriously thinking if I wanted to come back to this. My mind was wandering too easily, and not focusing on the task at hand, so I decided to go to the break room to get a much-needed coffee. I stood up and slowly made my way to the hallway that led to my goal. The hallways also had minimal lighting, kinda dehumanizing, working so hard to make the company money, and they won't even light the hallway properly for my hard-working ass. I get to the break room and switch on the light. I fill the coffee maker and switch it on. The way I was going, I figured I was going to be there a while. Luckily, the next day was a Saturday, so I wouldn't be working. As I was waiting for the coffee to make, I started getting an uneasy feeling, like a prickling at the back of my head and tunnel vision. I felt like I should just take off running, like a flight response, but I had no idea why. It was just the same break room that I frequented every day. I just guessed I was overtired and unused to working back so late alone. There was usually at least 1 or 2 others, but being all alone was a first for me. The coffee maker was doing that gurgling thing it does when it's almost finished. But at the same time, I'm sure I could hear a similar gurgling out in the hallway. Or was it in another room and I'm hearing it through the wall? Or back where the desks and cubicles are? I figured the silence and aloneness was playing with my head and my imagination was running wild. Although no amount of rationalizing could shake the uneasiness I felt. I just focused on the task at hand and made my coffee. As I opened the fridge to fetch the milk, I had the most overwhelming feeling that someone was right behind me. I stopped what I was doing and spun around. I was alone. But as I turned back to the fridge, something in the hallway caught my eye. I could have sworn I saw a head peeking in from the side of the doorway at me. It was like a normal guy, but someone had adjusted the contrast way too much, if that makes sense. Like the features were extremely shadowed and the eyes were more like dark pits. But it was only for a split second. I felt a weird mix of feelings at that moment. I was extremely creeped out, but at the same time relieved that I wasn't alone. And most of all, mad that whoever was with me was trying to spook me so much. Anger won out over the other emotions, and I ran out to the hallway on reflex. There was no one there. Feeling a little embarrassed that, as a grown man, I was letting being alone at night in my office freak me out so much. I quickly finished making my coffee and forced myself to return to my cubicle at a regular pace rather than hurried. I was just freaking myself out. If I rush, it'll only make me panic even more. I sat back at my cubicle, sipped my coffee, and got back to work. The coffee was gradually making me feel a bit better, as was focusing on my work. But I just couldn't shake the feeling someone was behind me, watching me, getting closer each time I stopped to think about it. I just hunkered down and got into my work. As time went on, I kept feeling some kind of breeze or wind brush against my neck, legs, arm. It was faint, so maybe just paranoia? I looked at my clock, 12:30 a.m. I was staying back later than I wanted. Then, the whispering started. Faint at first, but every so often, it would go past my ear with that breeze thing I experienced before. I kept trying to tell myself I was just tired, needed rest, was imagining things. Just gotta finish my work. Just 30 minutes more. Then, my lamp, the only light on the floor, started flickering. It must just be the globe, I told myself. Only 30 minutes, 50 minutes tops. I just kept trying to convince myself so I could finish and go home. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, things intensified to a level I couldn't rationalize away. The cubicle, 2 to my left, started to shake. Like the start of an earthquake, if you've ever experienced that. Then it stopped, briefly, only to resume in the cubicle right next to mine. I started packing my stuff up in a panic. Then it stopped. I waited in shock, planning my next move. It didn't resume. I started trying to decide what to do. It had stopped for about 5 minutes. Was it over? Just when I started to relax, my whole cubicle and desk started to shake violently. That was it. I was out. I grabbed whatever was close at hand. Luckily, my keys and wallet were in my jacket, which I made sure to grab. Unfortunately, in my panic, I only grabbed a third of what I needed to complete my work. But I didn't care. I was done. I rushed out so fast. When I passed the security guard in my mad dash out, he called after me, questioning me. But I couldn't understand. I was in such a panic. Call me a coward, but this was just too much. I changed jobs after my vacation. There was no way I could continue to work somewhere where I experienced such a terrifying event.
This is my sister's friend's story. I found it pretty creepy, so I figured you guys would too. My sister works as a nurse. When she was a student, she was sent to various hospitals to work with nurses. This was the same for all of her other student friends. My sister heard this story when she met up with one of her close friends. She said that even though they were sat in a warm coffee shop when she heard this story, she had chills race up her spine. So the hospital that my sister's close friend worked at was in a rural location. It wasn't your typical busy hospital. It didn't have that many patients. She was working the night shift on the night that this took place. She was doing her rounds, checking on the patients, the usual. There were only a few patients on her ward. They say those long, dark hospital hallways can be quite eerie in the dead of night. However, my sister and her friend tell me that you get used to that kind of thing after a while. I don't know if I could. I'm a bit of a scaredy cat. After doing her rounds, she headed back to the nurse's station to see how her colleagues on the night shift were doing. She was there updating some paperwork and chatting when she heard an alert. When a nurse call button is pressed, it sends an alert to the nurse's station. A patient needed some attention. There was one problem though. The room in which the nurse call came from was vacant. That room had been empty since a patient passed away in it last week. "Is this a prank?" one of her colleagues asked. "Well, someone pressed the call button, so I guess I better check it," she replied. She was a little scared, but since she was the student nurse, she thought she would show initiative rather than be told to do it. She was the youngest and got bossed around the most. So off she went to investigate the call from the empty room. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she walked down the hallway. She had always been terrified by the thought of the paranormal. She went down to the corner room in which the call came from and opened the door. She stepped inside of the dark, unused hospital room. There was no one in there. It was just an empty room. Maybe it's just a malfunction, a ghost in the machine. It was hard to say. She guessed that it could have been a prank too. Maybe some bored patient started scampering around the ward and then quickly ran back to bed. The button could be broken too. It could have been a number of things. She turned to leave the room, put her hand against the door to push it open, but it didn't budge. Locked. It was locked. How on earth? She began to panic. She started beating her hands against the door. All her logical thoughts had gone out of the window now. She was thinking of the paranormal. She knew that the call could only come when a button was pressed. Something called her into that hospital room, and now that same something didn't want her to leave. One of her colleagues came rushing over to the room she was trapped in and opened it from the outside. My sister's friend was an absolute mess. She was completely petrified. She said that she didn't feel alone in that room. Something was hiding in the shadows with her. Hospitals can be pretty scary places when you think about all that goes on in there. I mean, there must be some residual energy trapped in some of the rooms. She requested a transfer to a different hospital after that frightening experience. I wonder what it must have felt like to be trapped in that dark room, unable to get out.
Hi everyone, I'm Jack, and I work the 7-11 midnight shift. Once, I was doing the night shift, and my co-worker told me he would like to go outside to smoke a while. As there were no customers this late, I told him to come back in 10 minutes. While waiting, I took out my Manchester United magazine and started reading. As I was tearing at the Ryan Giggs poster, I heard the chime of the door sensor, and saw this man dressed in a black t-shirt and black cap enter. He proceeded to the Slurpee machine, and I carried on with my magazine, not wanting to bother him, although I wondered why he wanted a Slurpee this late. I heard the familiar sound of the machine vibrating as he pulled the valve. Suddenly, I heard a splash and thought he must have spilt the drink. Damn clumsy, I thought. And I thought of the mess I had to clean up later. As I left the counter to check it out, I saw that the man had gone. I peered over the shelves and tried to pick him out, but he was nowhere to be seen. I wondered how he could have possibly just disappeared. As I made my way back to the counter, I heard the door chime, even though there was no one at all. The door did not even open. I returned to the machine, and to my amazement, there was no spillage. I was so scared, I almost peed my pants. Don't laugh. Then my co-worker came back. I tried to tell him, but he just told me I had a screw loose. That idiot. Was I just seeing things? Or was it really a dead man buying a drink? I never allowed my co-worker to go out for a smoke again.
This happened when I was a student. I had a part-time job in a restaurant. The restaurant closed each night at 3 a.m. I was living in a student city. By that I mean there was no shortages of students looking for part-time work. I guess you could say I was lucky to have a job. One thing about living in a student city is that when it's Obon, everyone heads home. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Obon, so let me just explain it quickly. Obon is an annual Buddhist event for commemorating one's ancestors. It is believed that each year during Obon, the ancestors' spirits return to this world in order to visit their relatives. Obon is mainly observed from August 13th to the 16th. The Obon week in mid-August is one of Japan's 3 major holiday seasons. Pretty much all of the student workers were eager to either head home and see their families or simply have some time off for the Obon holidays. I was happy to keep working that summer though. I needed the money. The working rota would go like this. 1 full-time worker and 2 part-time workers would work most of the night shifts at the restaurant. And that was the same during Obon. The restaurant was in the middle of a row of houses. It was a renovated property. I mean the houses were detached and not next to the restaurant. That would have been annoying for the residents if that was the case. The second floor of the restaurant wasn't used for customers. It was used as a storage room where we kept equipment and supplies. There were some odd things up there. I don't know if the stuff up there belonged to the owner of the store, but there were family photos and a Buddhist altar. I never liked going up there at night when I was sent to get supplies. It creeped me out. The following incident happened on the 13th of August last year, the night before Obon officially began, just into the early hours of the actual day, and I'll never forget it. It had been a busy night. I was just about to finish my shift. I left the building to turn off the outdoor lighting in front of the restaurant. There was a motion sensor above the door to the restaurant, so when a customer walked through the door, it made a ping-pong sound that alerted us workers. When I came back inside, I started to clean the floor in the kitchen, hoping that we were done for the night. The other employees were back there in the kitchen with me, and they were cleaning down too. I heard the door sensor go off. I wondered if a customer had just walked through the doors, even though we were about to close. I called out a welcome as a kind of knee-jerk reaction. It was what we had to do every time a customer came through the doors. Someone's there. I went to look through the doors to see who was coming through them, and I was surprised to see that there was no one there. All the lights at the front of the store were off, and it was 3 a.m. We didn't usually have customers at that time of night. It was odd. The full-time employee came out from the back, and I looked over at him. He said, "Customer?" I walked back towards him and the kitchen and said, "No, actually." I could tell he was thinking the same thoughts as I was. Then why did we hear the entrance chime? We looked at one another in silence for a few moments. Then we heard a loud noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded as if something very heavy had been dropped or slammed. Naturally, the last couple of events had creeped us out. Was someone out there messing with us? We went to look out the back, but there was nothing, and no one out there. I guess that it might have been a stray cat knocking something off of a high place outside the back door. It's happened before. But this was Obon, and my head started to slowly fill itself with legends and ghost stories. The kind of stuff I had heard from a young age. The dead's spirits return for Obon, don't they? The logical part of my brain told me that it was nothing but a coincidence, and to just hurry up and finish my shift. I was thinking a lot of things. I can't remember them all. It's been about a year since this happened. We cleaned down and got everything we needed to do done. Last year, I didn't work Obon because I went home to see my family. One of the part-time employees said to me something like this happened last year too. I wondered if she was trying to purposely scare me or prank me. We were chatting and I felt as if she was about to tell me what happened last year, but she was interrupted by the sound of the sensor under the door. Ping pong. The timing seemed cartoon-like. This couldn't be real. At this time, I didn't say welcome. I just looked over to the dark entrance once again. There was no one there. It was actually scary at this point. It was as if something was there, we just couldn't see it. It was almost as if I could feel something staring straight at me, right out of the darkness. I didn't think my colleagues were pranking me anymore. I just wanted to leave, and thankfully I did without any further ghostly goings-on. I worked the night shift a few times after that, and nothing similar ever happened again. Well, the sensor at the entrance did malfunction once, but I feel like what happened to Obon was a bit different. I guess it probably doesn't sound as creepy as it was, but in those moments in the dark with something close by, I was terrified.
I've worked at a nursing home for the last 12 years, going on 13 this year. I work nights pretty much exclusively, and I'm very used to this place being in a much more liminal state than day shift sees. Empty halls, dim lights, far fewer people. It's not scary, it's strangely comfortable. That being said, a lot of people who have worked this shift with me claim we're haunted by at least a few different people who used to work or live here. I've personally only witnessed a few things, and none of them felt really malicious and have other explanations, so I just roll with it and move on. Here's a few things they've told me about, or that I've seen. 1. A woman in a brown skirt and jacket is sometimes seen by the CNAs walking the halls. If she goes into a room, we need to keep an eye on the resident because they're likely going to have health issues in the next 24 hours. More than one nurse has told me this is the case. I've never seen the woman, but they swear she's here, and she's the ghost of a former RN who is still doing rounds. 2. One of the units has a friendly little girl apparition apparently. Granted, a lot of our residents have dementia and tend to tell us things that aren't there all the time. Bugs, dogs, that kind of thing. But there's been very consistent reports of residents seeing this cute and sweet girl and talking to her, only to die the very next day, despite not really having any conditions that'd tank suddenly like that. But it only happens on this one unit, and no other ones in the building. Staff that work there regularly will always find an excuse to have a doctor see residents who start saying they've seen a little girl, even if they don't have any external signs of distress or anything. 3. Cold spots. People complain about these frequently, and sometimes it's just the roof fans blowing cool air into a hallway. At least once though, it was definitely a little more sinister. For a month or so after an ordinary resident passed a few years back, anytime someone went in the room they died in, they'd complain how cold it was. It was always a few degrees colder in there than the rest of the hall, even with the windows shut. Maintenance couldn't find a good reason for it, and it eventually just stopped on its own. But people hated going in there and said it felt like someone was watching and staring daggers into you. 4. Charts falling down. When we still used paper charts, more than once they'd have been completely settled on a shelf 1 second, and the next, a bunch would just fall to the floor. I saw that one a few times over the years, ranging from one chart to a solid dozen. No one could find a reason for that one either. Everything was stable and the shelves were level. The charts would just dump onto the floor. 5. Electronic nonsense. Okay, this one is my baby. I love this entity, or entities if they're a thing. And they're about the only ones I'll actively say are here when people ask. Everything electrical or electronic in this building acts strangely. It's not bad strange. Nothing life-threatening or anything. But call lights will go on and off on their own. Room lights and fans do the same. Sometimes the computers aren't right either, and the phones spent a week flickering in and out of static at one point. If it were just stuff that was plugged in, I would say it's just a messed up wiring situation, and that probably does play a part. But there's also several cases of battery-powered electronics doing this sort of thing. When we still had chair and bed alarms for people prone to dangerous self-transfers, they would go off when there was no one on them at all, or when people were completely still on them and asleep. The second you investigate by looking into the room, they'd stop. I liken this one to a bunch of playful kids, and I found when you're polite and ask, things sort almost immediately after. Weird stuff. 6. A few years back, I was sitting with a resident who was in the process of passing on. It was one of those this will likely be any minute situations, and their family was all in other states, and it would take a few days for them to get in. I don't like people to be alone in those moments, if I can help it, so I pulled up a chair and sat at bedside, talking to them, just so they had a voice. At the exact time the resident breathed their last, a music box that had been closed in a drawer near them started playing. As far as I knew, that music box had been broken for months prior to this, but the resident didn't want to get rid of it because grandchildren had given it to them. The box stopped when I took it out and opened it up, and I couldn't get it to work again afterward. It was really nice, like they were telling me they were all right now or something. There you go, the stories I remember from the night shift where I work. Make of them what you will.
This happened pretty recently, and because of it, I'll be quitting my job at the end of this month. My current job is to deliver papers to homes in the mountains, basically in the middle of nowhere. It's tough because I start work at midnight in order to get all of my deliveries done. And it doesn't exactly pay well, but it's good to be working, especially when you're young. You have your own money and it's nice, right? Anyway, like I said, I start at midnight and I don't finish until the sun comes up, and sometimes in the darker months, the sun doesn't come up at all. Being out in the mountains alone at night can be pretty spooky, as I'm sure you can imagine. I want to share my recent scary experience with you. It happened this winter. I had gotten used to the rhythm of deliveries by that point. It was around winter time that the newspaper company I worked for was trying to expand their business. This meant that there would be more work for me. I was excited to earn a bit more money, but over time, it became more and more time-consuming. Basically, a subscription would come in, and then it would be down to me to deliver it to the customer. So, I'm usually riding my bike around with a map because signal is a no-go in the mountains. And I don't mean a push bike, by the way. I mean a really low-quality motorbike. Low CCs. The people who buy these subscriptions have the amazing ability to be unfindable. It never felt as if it was straightforward. I had one of those subscription jobs on that winter's night. I knew the address, and I knew it wasn't going to be an easy night. There were a few roads through forest areas, and even worse was the fact that some of the roads were very narrow. I could barely ride my bike along them. I set off and rode my bike right up to the point where the narrow roads began. Since it was winter, I figured it would be safer if I just parked up my bike and delivered the subscription on foot. There was a footpath after all. There was a postbox at the end of the customer's drive. It was a short distance from the house. I started down the sloped road towards the postbox, and then I froze in my tracks. I heard the sound of a dog barking. No, not just one dog. It sounded like there were at least two. I thought not much of it and approached the postbox with the subscription in hand. It was still pretty much pitch black out, despite it being early morning. As I approached, I noticed a light go on at the front door. There was an old lady stood outside, under the porch. Seeing her gave me a fright. I thought to myself, wow, someone's super eager for the morning paper and this subscription. I figured that since she was out, I could literally put the subscription in her hand, so I approached her. I stopped when she started yelling at me. "Stop right there! What do you think you're doing?" "I'm delivering the newspaper." "And your subscription?" "The boss made us wear a uniform and we have to wear this ID card around our neck, as some customers, especially ones like this, who live in remote areas, can be skeptic of people they don't know. You know, stranger danger and all that." I raised my ID badge, as I assumed she could see me pretty well. "You expect me to believe that? You think that's proof?" She screamed at me. I could see the dogs, especially the whites of their teeth. They bared them at me while they snarled. The old woman then pulled out a pair of long gardening shears or scissors from behind her back and pointed them at me. I instinctively backed away. I just tried to remain as calm as possible. I was wondering if she was suffering with some kind of disease, maybe something like dementia. If she came at me with those long scissors, I planned on pushing them away or trying to kick her in the abdomen. I practiced full contact karate. However, she was an old lady. I don't know if I could have done that to her, and I hoped that it wouldn't come to that. I just said, "Well then, I'll just leave this here and be on my way," and with that I turned to leave. I didn't get paid enough to deal with this rubbish. I upped my pace as the old lady was still shouting at me. She sounded as if she was getting really riled up. The dogs were really barking at me now. I turned to look over my shoulder and I saw her let go of their leashes. She was walking towards me, slashing the air with her scissors. She wasn't making any sense. I couldn't make out a single word that she was shouting at me. And it was time to run now. I raced up the hill as I heard the dogs chasing me. I couldn't believe it. She literally released the hounds on me. I ran up the hill as fast as I could. I needed to get back to my motorbike. I got back to my bike, kicked out the stand and hopped on. I started the engine and had a quick look behind me, and I saw the tips of the dogs' heads coming up the slope and then I pulled away without looking back again. It was really scary, to be honest. I think myself incredibly lucky to get out of there without any injuries. I mean, it would be a different story if I had a push bike. Those dogs wanted to bite me, I could tell. The old woman looked as if she would have joined in too. I imagined her plunging those large gardening scissors into my gut. I shudder at the thought now. After I delivered all my newspapers and my subscriptions, I spoke with my boss and told him about my close call. He decided that he would make contact with the customer to see what was going on, and I could already imagine him taking the side of the customer. It was just the kind of guy he was. However, he found out that the customer's phone number was no longer in use, so he decided to go out there himself and speak to the customer in person. I told him to watch out for the dogs. He said that he would let me know how it went when I came back to work next. I spoke to him the next day and he told me he went out there to meet the customer, but he found nothing but an abandoned house. He then made contact with the subscription company to find out why someone would want to send a subscription to an empty house. It was at this point we learned that the subscription company had fudged the numbers to make our company take their business. They wanted it to look like they had more customers than they did. They had a quota to fill, so they gave out a couple of addresses of abandoned homes. That's stupid. Who the hell was that woman with the dogs then? I have no idea, but when I think back to it now, how hate-filled her face was, it just gives me the shivers, hence my resignation from the newspaper job. Anyway, I'm working till the end of the month, so I hope I don't get sent anywhere near the scissor woman's house. I only have a couple of days of work left, it'll be fine. Hi, there's a note from me, Jay. There were no other posts by this author.
I was once working as a DJ for SBC, to be exact, as a radio announcer in the Malay section. I encountered many strange things during my duties in the studio. Most of them happened in the basement of the radio building. One night, as I was working night shift, there was nobody around. Inside the studio, we call it Conti, was so cold. I was on duty alone that night. Suddenly, I felt too cold, and not due to the aircon. I felt somebody or someone was blowing behind my back. I was so scared that I had to start packing my things. It was 11:30 p.m, before my duty ends at 12 midnight. So I packed all the records and tapes that had been used for broadcasting that night. But, without my expectation, once I opened the door of one of the cupboards to keep all the records and tapes, suddenly I felt the wind was blowing very, very cold, and I could smell a nice fragrance like perfume. I heard a baby's voice calling out, "Mother, mother, mother." I was so shocked that I ran out of the Conti. Like, I don't know how to explain it. Imagine a baby's voice calling you mother. I was shivering all the way back home. Before I start, let me say I'm not unfamiliar with the paranormal. I've experienced whispers, shadow figures, sudden senses being triggered, etc. The only thing I haven't experienced is actually physically seeing a spirit. This leads me to my story. I work in a movie theater, so late nights are a normal thing. My co-workers are all pretty colourful people that tend to joke a lot, but almost all of us have one thing in common. We feel something off in one of the theatres. I first noticed it in the first month I worked there, and at first, it only felt like a mild discomfort. But as time went on, especially in February, the feeling only intensified. For clarification, it feels like something is constantly watching us with this intense malice. Like we shouldn't be there, and it wants us to know it. I had dealt with this intense feeling by just walking in and telling it that I was just getting in to do my job, and I'd be out of its hair in a few minutes. For a short time that actually stopped it. Until February. February 2020. I was working late, making sure the bar glasses were collected, and it came to the time of the night where I had to go into this particular theatre. I walked in and immediately, the feeling started up with far more malice than I was expecting. I gave it my usual spiel about getting out of there quick, but the feeling just intensified. I didn't find what I was looking for, so I decided to hightail it out of there, which usually helps. But this time, it decided to follow me. For context, I was moving at a near sprint, and this feeling went from somewhere in the middle of the screen to directly behind me. It stayed at my back the whole time I ran out of that theatre and into the next before just disappearing. Now, the little silhouettes I see in the dark in my apartment have begun to increase in sightings, and I'm not sure what it is. Hopefully, someone has an answer for this because I haven't been back to work in a while. So I'm hoping to have some kind of answer on this thing.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.